Haegl befhuitast corner, hueft hit on heavenus liefde, wheel calf hit winde schurle, whale theft hit to waterla sithan.
Hola, Wezach Hægl und Beof Willkommen. Welcome to part 1 of this video about the Anglo-Saxon rune Hægl. Now firstly I'd just like to apologise for the fact that it has probably been a year since I last made one of these videos. Life threw me a curveball which kind of stopped me from making videos, but I am hopefully now back to bring you more videos about the Anglo-Saxon runes. So just start by saying Ich bidde eau underliet, willa je theovoniaf to min folkneef, Ich bidde eau. Now we're in a very interesting place to make this video today. I'm in a place called the Thicks, which is an amazing wood full of so many very ancient oaks and hollies. It's very close to Staverton Park, and I'm only about 5 miles from the amazing ship burial at Sutton Hoo, where I plan on going tomorrow. Now some people believe that these woods have been here for a very, very long time, and there is a theory that these woods were the ancient hunting ground of the Wofingers, the East Anglian royal family. So we're here today to talk about the Anglo-Saxon rune Hægl. Now I'm going to start with a little about the pronunciation. This letter is pronounced as an A, so it's very similar to the modern pronunciation, but it's kind of Hægl. It's a bit kind of East Anglian actually. So let's hear the rune poem. Hægl befhuitast corner, hueft hit on heavenus liefde, wheel calf hit winde schurle, whale theft hit to waterla sithan. And in modern English, Hægl is the whitest of grain. It is whirled from the vault of heaven and is tossed about by gusts of wind, and then it melts into water. So on the face of it, this rune poem is fairly literal. There don't appear to be too many twists and turns and double entendres involved in this poem. Let's look at some of the significant words that we hear within this Old English rune poem. So first we have huitast, which translates as whitest from the noun huit. Now in the translation of white in Old English into modern means bright, clear, fair and splendid. Then we have the word hueft from the weak verb huerthan, which means to turn, revolve, move about, go, return or depart. We have lieft. Now lieft can mean air, atmosphere, breeze, sky, heavens or cloud. And then we have the strong verb wielkan, which means to roll, revolve, move around or toss. Shower, as you might guess, very similar, isn't it? Storm of rain, snow, hail, etc. So a hailshire is of course a hail shower. And we also have the strong verb weolthan, which means to come to be made, to arise, come and be. and lastly Sithan, which is afterwards. Now let's hear the poems in both Icelandic and Norwegian, for this is a rune which is shared in both the elder and the younger Futhorc. So the Icelandic poem: hail, cold grain, and shower of sleet, and sickness of serpents. And the Norwegian poem: Hægl is the coldest of grain, Christ created the world of old. So unlike some of the other poems we've looked at, where we also have poems from Norway and Iceland, we can see that the meaning across all three of these poems is fairly consistent. Anglo-Saxon, the whitest of grains; in Norwegian, the coldest of grains. It's certainly cold today. It's absolutely freezing. It's January and it is very, very cold, as you can probably tell. Now, in the Norwegian poem, as we often see in some of the Old English poems, no doubt the mention of Christ has probably replaced an older version which mentioned a heathen god, so it's basically been Christianized. And in the Icelandic poem we hear mention of a sickness of serpents. Now this seems kind of obscure. I might have some ideas on that later, which we'll mention in a subsequent episode about this rune. Now let's look at the shape of the rune, shall we? So the Old English rune for Hægl is slightly different to that which we see in the Elder Futhorc. So this is the Old English one, okay, and this is the Elder Futhorc, and this is how it's shown in the Younger Futhorc. Now, Hægl gets a mention in two of the Elegaic Anglo-Saxon poems that I have mentioned before in previous videos. First we have the Seafarer. That semon ne wat, theihim on foldan, ferlos limpef, huich charlie, is cheldna sai, winter wunada, rachen, lastum, winna mayem birolen, behongen, hrim yechelum, hail, shurlum, thlea. And in modern English: this the man does not know, for whom on land it turns out most favourably, how I, wretched and sorrowful, on the ice-cold sea, dwelt for a winter in the paths of exile, bereft of friendly kinsmen, hung about with icicles, hail flew in showers. And we also hear mention of Hægl in the Wanderer, another Elegaic poem. Thonna on Wachnef eft, Winnaleas guma, Yesif him befallen, Felwe weyas, Bathiem blimfulas, Bladen fefra, Hlizon hrim on snow, Hægl yemendeged. Then the friendless man wakes up again. He sees before him fallow waves, seabirds bathe, preening their feathers, frost and snow fall mixed with hail. Now, what's apparent in both of these poems, and I have spoken at length previously about the Anglo-Saxons' love of Elegaic poetry, is that in both of these descriptions they are trying to invoke a sense of misery, and both of them relate to winter and to the cold. And I guess there's a link between being cold and being miserable. I'd certainly feel a lot happier if I wasn't quite so damn cold as I am at the moment. Now, the interesting thing about hailstorms is that they don't generally happen in the winter. In fact, the meteorological data from the UK, which has actually been gathered since 1650, tells us that the most intense hailstorms historically happened between the months of May and September, with most hailstorms happening in July, and the most intense ones in July. Now, certain areas of the country are more affected than others. The East Midlands, East Anglia, where we are now of course, and then we also have the Greater London and adjacent counties. Now, interestingly, these are all the areas which were first settled by the Germanic migrants, the areas where the original pagan Anglo-Saxons lived before they later spread their way westwards. Now, when we think about Hægl for the Anglo-Saxons, we have to think about it in the context of agriculture. Now, these days most people are pretty far removed from farming. If you need food, most people just go to the supermarket where it's been conveniently packaged and sanitised for us to buy. This is the way modern life is, but for the Anglo-Saxons there were no such luxuries. The early medieval times were tough times. They were times where everybody's lives depended upon the harvest. Now, we must remember that the agricultural world, it defined the Anglo-Saxons world. Most people lived in rural settlements. Everybody was attuned to the rhythms of the land and the seasons, and this pervaded through all elements of Anglo-Saxon lives. So farming, it fed the people. It allowed other areas of life to flourish, such as the arts, warfare, craft. Everything depended upon reaping the harvest from the land. Without it, society would cease to function. So where does Hægl come in, and what is the significance of this poem? Now, as I may have mentioned before, I'm pretty sure I have, my dad is an East Anglian farmer who comes from a very, very long line of people that work the land, farm labourers, people that work the land in East Anglia. And if we go far enough back, we find that he was descended from a Frisian who at some point came over to these shores in a longboat, settled in the fertile lands of East Anglia and began farming, moved from one low-lying region to another. And my dear old pa has been a farmer. He's now in his early 70s. He has been farming since he was a boy. So I decided to ask him about the impact of Hægl, because I don't know anybody who has more of an understanding about the agriculture of the land here in East Anglia. And what he told me was that Hægl can have a very, very detrimental effect on all crops, but that some crops are more susceptible to Hægl than others. Now, as I mentioned earlier, most hailstorms occur between May and September. So what kind of impact does this have upon the crops? So I asked my dad his opinion on this.
That is particularly when most crops are very susceptible, because they are young, and damage at that point has a big impact on them.
So from the mouth of a farmer, we hear that the effects of Hægl can have far-reaching consequences, which ultimately affect the yield, and this can have a detrimental effect on the harvest, which could result in hungry bellies. Now, my mum told me a story that her mum, my dear old Nan, who incidentally, it would have been her birthday today, I think she'd have been 95 today actually, bless her. she told a story about when she was a young woman and she was out in the fen on a delivery for the shop where she worked, and it was August, it was late summer, and the fields around her were planted up with onions, which had yet to be harvested because the onion harvest is a little bit later than that. Now all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the most ferocious hailstorm swept in. Now my nan said that the hailstones were the biggest that she had ever seen. Close by to where she was some greenhouses, and the glass within the greenhouses was being smashed to bits. Now what she recounted was the air around her was thick with the smell of onions, because the hailstorms had just pelted the onions and smashed their stalks to bits. Now this hailstorm had been so extreme and sudden in its nature that the interesting thing is the first thought that crossed my nan's mind, you know, the mind of that young woman, was that it was the end of the world. Now that is the thought of a modern day person. So we have to think about how it would have seemed to the Anglo-Saxons. Now let's go back to onions. Now onions were a staple crop for the Anglo-Saxons, and as any good cook knows, you know, they add a lot of flavour and interest to food. So I had a look at some Anglo-Saxon recipes, and onions actually feature quite heavily within these onions, so we have to assume that they use them a lot. Now they actually liked onions so much that they even wrote a riddle about them, and you may remember that from one of my previous videos when I spoke about a rather saucy riddle that they have in the Exeter book which relates to onions. Well, let's say the clean answer is onions. We won't go into what the alternative naughty answer to the riddle was. Ich eum wunderlicher wheat, weavem on heater, neo buendum neat, neum scheffer, berg sitengler, nympha bonum annum. You may remember, I am a wondrous creature, a joy to women, a help to neighbours. I harm none of the city dwellers except for my killer. So as we heard from my nan's experience, onions are one of the crops which are particularly vulnerable to the effects of hail. Now my dad is actually an expert onion grower. You know, he grows a good onion, does Farmer Turner. So I asked him about the effect of hail on onions.
Yes, well, onions are very much at risk because they have a hollow leaf. That'd be the only crop I can think that does actually have a hollow leaf, and once that's punctured, that can cause other problems to come from that.
Interestingly, one of the things about hail is that the way it's formed are kind of like concentric rings of ice. So the structure of a hailstone is actually very similar to the structure of an onion. So in a society where the success of the people was so very strongly linked to the harvest, hail could mean that people went hungry, that tummies were not filled, and if not destroying a crop, then definitely decreasing its yield. And the fact that the poem refers to hail as a grain, the whitest corner, we see how very linked this meteorological event is to the harvest. Now in Britain we definitely don't get hail to the same size or severity as they do in some countries, for example the United States or India, where hail can be absolutely huge and can do untold damage. Not so much in England. So I asked my dad how big he'd ever seen hailstones in his lifetime as a farmer.
well, certainly pea-size, yes, quite a number of times, and I suppose the biggest would be getting up towards marble size.
Oh my goodness.
That "oh my goodness" there was my dear mother, by the way. So let's have a look at some of the stats for hail in the UK. Now, the earliest severe hailstorm that we have on records actually happened in May in the year 1141 in a place called Wellersbourne in Warwickshire. Now, apparently there was at least one fatality from this hailstorm, which would lead us to believe that the hailstorms that fell on that day were very large indeed. Now, there is a scale which is used to measure hailstorms known as the H scale. So on this scale, H1 is classified as potentially damaging and is said to cause slight general damage to plants and crops, whereas an H10 is classified as a super hailstorm, which can cause extensive structural damage and even possibly the risk of death to anyone who is unfortunate enough to be caught out in the hailstorm. Now, the most intense hailstorm ever recorded in Britain measured it as H8 on the scale. While several storms which could be classed as H7 have occurred in Britain, that being hailstones of 2 to 3 inches, which is pretty damn big, isn't it? Which could cause severe damage to roofs and risk of serious injuries. There has only ever been one which got up to the scale of H8. Now, this happened on the 15th of May in the year 1697 in Hitchin in Hertfordshire, and then northeastwards to Potton in Bedfordshire. Now, at a place called Offley near Hitchin, the hailstones were measured, which had a diameter of 4.5 to 5 inches. Wow. And there was at least one human fatality, who was a poor young shepherd who happened to be caught out in the hailstorm. So we hear that great oaks were split, the ground was tore up, and there was widespread damage to houses. Now, the town of Horsham in Sussex lays claim to having the largest hailstone ever recorded in British meteorological history. Now, this could be because in other times, in other places, the hailstones haven't actually been measured. But the Horsham hailstone that fell to the ground on the 5th of September in the year 1958 weighed a whopping 190 grams, which is 6.7 ounces. That is one big hailstone. But there are reports of hailstones weighing in at over 220 grams, that's 7.7 ounces, during the Great Somerset hailstorm, which happened on the 15th of July in 1808. Wowzers, you really wouldn't want one of those hitting you on the head, would you? Now, regarding the Great Hailstorm of Somerset in 1808, the Western Flying Post had this report of the hailstorm. In the park of the Earl of Digby, one large oak tree was struck in a very surprising manner, the middle part or heart of it being left standing and the limbs shivered to pieces. 2 sheep were killed under a tree in the same park, and the tree in no degree injured. The hailstones which fell at Milbourne Port, Pointington, Yarlington, Corton and other places are reported to have been of a magnitude exceeding anything we have before heard of, to the destruction of many glass windows, cucumber frames, etc. Pretty devastating. And the Bath Chronicle reported that a very valuable horse belonging to Mr. Hyatt was struck by lightning dead in the field. It also reported on damage caused to crops. Very great damage has been done to the corn. Father Hockey in particular will be a sufferer of more than £500. Farmer Brown upwards of £360. Farmer James upwards of 160. Many hailstones measured from 6 to 9 inches in circumference. So with this kind of damage being caused by hailstorms, is it really any wonder that the Anglo-Saxons, these early people, had a poem dedicated to this phenomena? Because what we can see here is hail, in extreme cases, can cause immense damage, great injury, fatalities. And certainly in a subsistence economy where people depended so heavily upon a good harvest, hail could be absolutely devastating. So I think it's fair to say that in most cases, hailstorms, in all their violent, thundery glory, they tend to come very, very quickly, suddenly, out of nowhere, unleash in sometimes quite dramatic circumstances, and then just fade away because of the warmer temperatures. Because these events happen during the warmer times, the water quickly melts away, and it's almost as if they'd never happened at all, unless of course they've caused damage. So I've never claimed to be a tarot expert at all, but I do believe that if you had to liken the energy of this rune to a tarot card, it would be the Tower. Change and destruction which come very, very suddenly without warning. So during this video we've looked at some of the consequences of a hailstorm and the damage and the destruction which they can cause within a subsistence agrarian society. But what if things got really bad? I mean, like really seriously bad. Well, during the 6th century, something happened. Something catastrophic happened which changed the lives of the Anglo-Saxons. And we'll be talking about that in part 2 of this video. So I would just like to thank you for watching, thank you for bearing with me, and once again I'm sorry about the very long break since I last recorded a video. If you've liked this video, please subscribe. Next part of this episode will be a little bit more interesting, I think. I've got some really interesting things to talk to you about then. And for now, thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already. I really do appreciate your support. This is a small channel and it would be really good to be able to grow it, to get the information about the Anglo-Saxons out there. And for now, all I have to say is farewell well und beof Halle, and I will see you for the next part of this video about the Anglo-Saxon rune Hægl. Ayla.